to StoryTalk, a roundtable appreciating short fiction, a single story at a time. My name is Matthew Schmidt, and I'm here today with Ingrid Wenzler
Hi.
and Adam al-Sirgany. Hello. We are going to discuss a piece from Kelly Link. Today's story is Two Houses. From her collection Get in Trouble, which came out in 2015, Two Houses by Kelly Link is a mixture of science fiction and horror that follows the crew of a spaceship heading to Proxima Centauri in search of another inhabitable planet. Obviously, Earth has continued to be decimated by humankind, and space travel is one of the last gasps to continue civilization. The crew is aboard a ship named House of Secrets and initially had been accompanied by a sister ship, House of Mystery, when they left Earth in 2059 during the third age of space travel. However, 30 years ago, House of Mystery disappeared, and no one knows what happened to it. The story begins when astronaut Gwenda is woken by the ship, or the ship's essence, Marine, who controls everything on the ship, but also has the ability to access all of the astronauts' memories and lives. The premise for waking Gwenda is to celebrate fellow crew member Portia's birthday, but in fact, it turns out to be Gwenda's birthday. To celebrate, the crew tell each other ghost stories that Marine sequences as if they are actually inside a simulation of the story being told. All right, so not too much is going on in this story, right?
Yeah.
So let's start out with the frame of the story, right? So basically, we've got these space explorers, and that frame story is followed by several nested ghost stories told by characters within the frame story. These nested stories are recreated as facsimile within the environs of the spaceship. This allows for multiple genres to flow into each other, so we get sci-fi, horror, the cowboy genre, some English provincial, and crime stories that emerge. How do you see these shifts operating in the story, and what ethos do these many genres lend the story?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time thinking about this question in particular, and I mean, obviously, storytelling is a frame, right? Like, goes back a long way. I think probably farther than this, but for me, this one, I thought about The Turn of the Screw, I thought about, right, Wuthering Heights, but I think that there's something kind of Chaucer-esque about the way this particular story works, that there is a generalized mission, and that there's an occasion to tell stories as a way of entertaining ourselves, and I think that becomes particularly important. There's something about space life for these people that goes to a sort of pre-modern pleasure in that way, which isn't to say that we don't take pleasure in telling each other stories all the time, but the stories as just the occasion themselves, right? Like, at one point, there's so many characters in the story, I confuse them because I'm bad with names, but I think it's Cece says, or not Cece, the girl who starts with an M.
Marine?
May says that, like, she just wants, instead of telling ghost stories, she wants to gossip and talk about when they had sex lives. Right, that there's something about what they lose, right? Like, it's not real beef Wellington. That there's, like, right, there are these aspects of that kind of imagined or partially fake world that, like, push them back into these small pleasures.
And by beef Wellington, you mean like the meal they eat for the birthday?
Right, and the birthday they have. Real beef, or fake beef Wellington, or not real beef Wellington, I think is how it's put. And they have real asparagus, and the chickens have started laying eggs again, so they get some poached eggs. But I think there's something about that format that really works, right? That like absent certain kinds of interaction, absent a sort of freedom of movement, absent anything like death in the near future or something, right? This kind of float into space. And the uncertainty of whether or not they'll find a Goldilocks planet, which is, a metaphor true to the language of space travel, but is also another kind of odd genre dropped in indirectly. Because of limitation, the narrative as an exercise makes sense, but it's also a way of explicating the weirdness of their lives, right? Like, because one thing I don't know that you mentioned is that they're actually living within a hyper reality where these tropes are built around them, including when the ghost stories are being told about literal spaces. They are those spaces as they were because Maureen has access to that. And I think that kind of, that shifting reality, that living in the internet vibe, I think, I don't know, says or doesn't say something about progress as a method for not moving at all, or just reframing existing things. But I think Ingrid probably has more elaborate thoughts on genre qua genre and not just, the state of the world.
Adam, I agree that the story, while it is futuristic, sort of takes us back to this kind of, it's almost like the quiet of sitting around a campfire and sharing stories that way. So, Matthew, to go back to your question about shifts and how they're operating. So one way they operate is during the birthday party, they decide they want to tell stories, and they actually just switch. One person tells a story, another person tells a story. They take turns. I also looked at some moments where Link is shifting in other ways. So especially as she's sort of establishing the reality and world of this space. So one instance is this: outside the great windows, the gardeners and the rose bushes disappeared. Now you saw a neat little farm and rocky hill fields. That's how she glides into, one reality as opposed to another very quickly, within 2 sentences, just like that. And what she does to sort of slow it down is she has one of the characters, whose name I have no idea how to pronounce, confirm it. So, yes, I am said exactly like that. That's one way that she ends up sort of illustrating the ways in which Maureen, who's, I don't know how to describe her. How would you describe Maureen?
Maureen is a roving consciousness who seems to be able to speak, or at least communicate in human language simultaneously into all the heads of the characters, and who, I don't know, I think has a not entirely neutral relationship both to the ship and to the people on the ship.
Yeah, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves with Maureen, because I know Matthew has a question about her, but basically I think that's well put. She's kind of the architect of their world, but also sort of a robot type figure. So those are how some of the shifts operate. When it comes to genre, I had a tough time thinking about this question. I think it's a really good question, and one that pushed me to look at the story in a lot of different ways. I think what all those genre shifts do for me is they they insist that I don't think of this story just in terms of sci-fi. And, they insist on saying, like, no, this isn't just that again and again in different ways. And I think end up making the world as a whole, give the world as a whole sort of a different feel. What do you think about that, Adam?
Yeah, I think that one thing that you're drawing my attention to that I maybe only tangentially thought about previously is that because of the literalization, right, like, they're not only living, if I were a kind of fly on the wall observing it, they're kind of living in a movie and shifting sets. But I think for them, there's a hyper reality to that, and they're aware that it's going to end, right? Like, it's a little like, psychedelia or something, right? You know it's going to end, but maybe you don't know it's going to end because the reality that you can potentially experience is entirely encompassed by the situation. But also, I think that reinforces the oddity of the pleasure of the storytelling itself, which maybe is a function of just being a writer who's operating on the page, that the individuals still have to speak out to each other, or are speaking out to each other, despite the fact that Maureen is illustrating it. It's not just projecting images on the wall. They're still, right, like, because presumably Maureen could also do that, right? Like, just play, instead of gossiping, like, play a porno of, like, what people did, or, like, instead of, like, telling the ghost stories, play the film of the guy rolling around on the floor,
Right.
Or the ghost, like, creeping or whatever, right? Like, there's something actualized differently by telling the story, which involves the potential for exaggeration or lie, or for the personal emotional experience of the oddity of it, that isn't just like, and now you're here, that happens as a result of that. And because some of those thoughts are new to me, I don't have a fully formed thing, but I think there's something going on there that maybe the two of you can help elaborate for me.
Yeah, I guess I'll just quickly say that, in terms of setting, you're right, that there could be different approaches to that. I think another thing that comes to mind, too, is that these characters have known other worlds, or that they've known Earth, and they're familiar with genre, they're familiar with pop culture, and that also gives the story a different feel than one that's trying to situate characters in a world that's, strictly not Earth, or Earth, and then this other space.
Yeah, I think one thing that the multiple genres brings out is the fact that Kelly Link and I agree on the fact that genre doesn't matter. And I talked about this a little bit further in a few episodes ago, but right, there's this mixing of genres that happens so quickly that you kind of forget you're in a space story at a certain point within this literal story as you're reading it, because you're like, all right, now we have to go over here to England, and we're like in this place, and we like can see and feel, and even Marine, the ship, can elicit the smells of these places, right? So it's like a total washing over of the realm as you're listening to a story and like somewhat participating in it. And maybe to go back to what Adam said about the internet, is that one thing about the internet is right? It offers us so many tools, but at the same time, like one of the easiest things is to get sucked down rabbit holes, as we call them. And so, like, you're reading an article about something, you're like, oh, I don't know about this, and you like go down that hole for a while, and then you come back and you're like, oh, I might want to finish that article, and then you're like, oh, there's something else interesting, I'm going to go down that hole, right? And they might be completely different things that you're investigating, and you know, I kind of think of Marine as this like advanced AI being that in some ways is inhabiting that fear that we have of giving machines too much autonomy over us, right? Um, and that leads into my next question very nicely, in a way that, you know, we've talked about when you're telling a story, like you have the occasion to lie because you're the one telling the story, or at least exaggerate, or pump up some of the details because when you're telling a story, you want people to like the story, right? So you're like, oh, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? You build it up in a way that is enjoyable, for your audience. So this story begins with a lie, right? It's supposedly Portia's birthday, but it turns out that that was a lie just to wake Gwenda up to celebrate her birthday, right? And the story could be said to build or not upon lies, right? So Cece claims to see the missing sister ship House of Mystery, but Marine can find no footage or other data to support this assertion, right? That's one lie that happens, or potential lie at least, right? And this is what I find really interesting, is that the person lying is not just possibly one person. It's multiple people and or the ship, right? Because in this situation, Cece could have seen something or not. And Marine could actually have data to suggest that the ship was there, but not divulge that information. And it only comes about because there are so many things, right, that seem unsure. At one point, Gwenda isn't sure what is real, even whether they are real, thinking, quote, the crew were all only shadows floating in shadow. Later, the crew speculates on the existence and nature of ghosts. So I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on speculation and facsimile within the story, including Marine's abilities, the lost sister ship, ghosts, reliability of secondhand stories. Is the crew even alive?
So a simple question.
Yeah.
I'll get us started. So the story is rife with speculation of all kinds. I tried to list out a few examples, but I mean, it's so full of speculation that, I think the challenge is more to like find a pattern within the speculation between us. So some examples: was Maureen the golden light ahead or the darkness that followed behind? What makes a haunted house? Can the real live people who go and walk around in one house or another, or even better, the ones who live in a house without knowing which house is which, would they know which one was real and which one was ersatz? So, I mean, speculation comes as question. And there are a lot of very direct questions about what's happening within the story, what's true, what's a lie. There's also another kind of speculation about, like how things look, or I guess what's happening, that feels a little more indirect to me. I'd love it if one of you could elaborate on that a little better than I feel like I'm flailing a little. And then in terms of facsimile, again, like, if the story is rife with speculation, I would say there's even more in the way of facsimile. It comes even linguistically, I noticed really early on. There's a lot of doubling. You get, the story opens with wake up, And you get that again immediately. Wake up, Gwenda, wake up, hurry, hurry. Duplicates come up a lot. You have Maureen, who's inside of you. But then you have a lot of reversals that happen early on as well. Maureen went before and after. Lights flicked on, then off again. I looked at the tattoos as a kind of facsimile. The birthday party, having a fake party for Gwenda or Portia's birthday, the confusion there. And then Adam's already alluded to this a little bit, but I mean, this is where the facsimile starts to take on meaning for me. When the party starts to happen, the food is introduced and you get lines like these. The candles were not real, but the cake was. And then you get beef Wellington as a fake with asparagus and new potatoes that are both real, and sourdough rolls that were realish. The point that this starts coming up, I start thinking a lot about what the story's going to be about, and I start to feel like it's going to be about what's real and what's not. And I also start to wonder if I can trust the story to tell me what's real and what isn't. In these moments, it's telling me very directly, it's categorizing for me. But in others, that kind of breaks down. I got really confused about the birthday party and what was going on there. And I mean, I think we'll talk more about other confusions that come up later that are very rich, but I'm babbling a little, so turn it over.
I don't know that you're babbling. I think that there's just a lot there in terms of the kinds of imagery in recreated world and falsity of world and the way in which that world allows both for falsity, right? Like in the way that Link presents it, right? Like the sourdough bread was sort of real, right? Like, but the beef Wellington is not real, and the way in which that realness is articulated isn't articulated as, right, like vegan beef, right? It's it could be vegan beef, or it could be something like the illusion of consuming something at all because Maureen has this remarkable capacity to present the human beings the complete plurality of their senses, such that they might just experience the taste of beef Wellington and feel as though they're taken back to something like a meal that they might have had on Earth. And I think that, like, on top of that, there's this weirdness of the way, right, like, we're told things about them, for instance, that they are intentionally paired because of their capacity to be together as a group, which I think creates real dynamics, right? It's the imaginary community's problem that, like, you can tell two people, right? Like, it's, you know, what every, like, old dude is trying to do at a diner when he sees, like, two young people together and he's going like, oh, you're such a beautiful couple, you're gonna get married someday or something, right? Like, and that there's something both about that might be really aggravatingly untrue, or that might present an idea to two people that they express something externally that therefore makes them compatible, that makes them try to be compatible and adapt and do those things. And I spent a lot of time in the story because of that early moment where you're told the crew is supposed to fit together, thinking about, do they really fit together? Is there anything about this that actually works? Who tells them that this happens? And I think that I think likewise, right? Like I think the story ends up inferring bigger and bigger questions about what those doublings do, right? Like Gwenda actually has tattoos of both ships on her hands, and at the same time, the perception is that the crew 30 years ago witnesses the disappearance of the second ship. By the end of the story, I think the question becomes, are they on the ship that disappeared? And in that way, right, like something sort of pleasantly untrue as a party, like being for one person, it's actually for another person, but everyone's asleep, and who the hell knows why they didn't get woken up for Portia's birthday, or why this birthday matters if sometimes you sleep through several years at a time, so on and so forth, or if every time you just wake up and you're all together is inherently a party because that's what you're doing, because you've been asleep for ages. I think those things start to be the way that life takes on meaning for these people who are drifting around looking for a planet, but that bigger kind of existential question like lingers in the background for me, and it builds through the process of artificiality. And I think that that's what it's doing. As a long blather about the potential that none of us are real, but
well, I mean, it's interesting. Like you know, you both brought up the meal, right? And that's such a small thing because like the way it's presented in the book is like beef Wellington and then like in parentheses, not real.
right.
And like it's such a small, quick thing that if you don't like think about it for a second, you just like skip over it. And so you're like, so that the second time you read it, you're like, did I even read this story? You know, in a certain respect.
Yeah.
Because there's so many things happen, you can't remember every exact detail. But like thinking about making meaning, right? Like think about food on spaceships in film today, right? It just all looks the same. It looks like mush or gruel or something like that. And you just label it and you're like, this is beef Wellington. And so like, because the astronauts are from Earth, they know what beef Wellington is.
Right.
And so in their mind, they're like, oh yeah, beef Wellington. When it could be anything. Another interesting thing this brings up is a little off topic, but I find it fascinating to think about. And that is, right, the crew being perfect for each other. When I was in high school, there was like this questionnaire all around Valentine's Day, and a computer tabulated your potential love interests throughout the rest of the high school.
Yeah.
Because everyone answered these questionnaires, and then it printed out like on that old paper with the things you tear off the sides, you know.
Yeah, this is terrifying and healthy, clearly.
Right, and you were listed at like percentage wise how you would connect with all these people.
Oh my God.
And you're sitting there going, really? For the ones that you're like, no way. And then for the ones that you like, you're like, no, definitely.
Yeah.
Because you already have that in your mind. I just want to let that sit for a second. It's a very strange thing for a high school to do.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Borderline dangerous.
Yeah, I know. Hey, this was back before when you could get away with anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
I don't know. All right, to get back on track here. We could
Okay.
we could begin this story with any member of the crew and Marine. Why do we start with Gwenda, the completely tattooed astronaut? Right? She's tattooed head to foot. It's like what she brings into space with her, right? As opposed to some of the other things, like other people bring books or like their knitting needles or whatever. And, you know, we also get the fact that Gwenda and Cece hold each other throughout the ghost stories, and that originally, right, each crew member was going to select one of Gwenda's tattoos as a starting point to begin their tale, and it wasn't going to be a ghost story necessarily. You would just make up a tale about one of her tattoos. But this is, squashed by Portia very abruptly, just after that has been the recommendation for the evening's entertainment, so to speak, right? Gwenda doesn't bother her at all. She assents. She's like, yeah, that's fine, that's fine. My question is, how do you see her relationship with the other astronauts? Because, the story is basically following her. And we get the most interiority, I would say, of Gwenda. Particularly her relationship with Cece and Portia, as well as Maureen. How do you see those unfold?
Yeah, man. I think that in some ways this goes back to your first question, because I think Gwenda is the character who, both because her tattoos have this sort of plethora of, literary lines on them, because they represent these kind of various earth culture things, because they do all of these it's sort of an impossible number of the tattoos. And because, right, like, you learn something either about the ship or about the way in which they got to the ship by the fact that she has the ships themselves tattooed, and there's one on each hand, and you know which hand is which, despite the fact that the ships are presumably identical. Anyway, like, all those weirdnesses are there. But I think all the other characters, there's something about kind of genre elements about them, which doesn't necessarily mix up or match up with the way in which they end up telling ghost stories. Right, like, Cece is a cowgirl, but she's also South African, right? Like, she's got this kind of attitude about it. Portia is, right, like, this very posh character in some ways, but also a little, I wish I had a better word than, like, a little, like, basic. And, like, May, who says next to nothing throughout the story, is maybe deep basic, right? Like, but, like, I did that just for the look on your face. No one will be able to appreciate. No, I think that they take on these kind of, like, these flat character aspects that are articulated through how they react to narrative more than what we actually learn about them as people and how they react in general. And I think that, I don't know, there's something about Gwenda and her way of interacting which she doesn't think of them as tropes or characters, right? But she does mostly interact with the other people apart from holding Cece, which might still be like an interaction of use, right? Like, she acquiesces to things and then she asks for things. But there's these very functional relationships, right? They hang out, they dance, they don't, like, they're not in a world space where their kind of emotional lives matter very much beyond the sort of party activity that they're doing, which is sort of what makes the structured party the perfect place to be telling this story to begin with. But I think if you got into the heads of the other characters, because they have, at least the way they present has so much more to do with trope, I think that if you got into those heads, you'd lose something about the trope. And I don't know, I guess I would, I think that there's something about Gwenda as the image of potential through her language, through her image, through who she is, that, like, opens up there. And so that's the tie point to, like, in some ways, my thinking about this is that Gwenda seems real to me. The others might not be real. And then the ship might not be real, or it might be displaced somewhere. And if it were displaced somewhere, there's still a reality to being displaced, right? Like if you're the ship that disappears, but you are somewhere, which, not to drag in other stories from this book, but I was reading through the Demon Lovers story, right? And like there's a whole group of nudists who disappear, and again, ghosts are part of the question, but also there's this possibility that they just exist somewhere else, and you don't stop going on because people don't believe you, and people just stop believing in you, and you go on in whatever way you are if you have a way of thinking. I think that Gwenda to me is the obvious character who I'm capable of connecting with in a way that makes me believe she goes on regardless of where the ship is, and who else does or does not exist within the context of the ship.
Yeah, I think this story is tremendously and maybe a little deceptively careful about which character we're following here. I think this is always a good story to ask, a good question to ask about stories. Why are we following who we're following, and could we be following another character? What would this story look like then? I think it's an especially great question when we're dealing with such a large cast, and one that's difficult to track on first read. So here are my thoughts on Gwenda. We start out with her, and I think there's a reason why Adam feels like she's the most human immediately. She's slower, she dawdles, she's late to her party or Portia's. And she doesn't have Maureen cut her hair. That's one of the first things that we find out about her. In a very strange image, sort of like fills a birth because it's so long. She can have this done, but she decides not to. Like, this is something that immediately makes me say to myself, okay, she's more human than the others. She's also got tattoos, and I think that cues us immediately to a thing that we're going to be thinking about throughout this story. What's real, what's not, what's a copy of something else. And I think another thing that I thought about related to this was, because there are so many stories within this story, and because the characters are all taking turns, I thought about the order of those stories and where we end up. Cece's story is one of the longest stories, and it's the one that makes us most question the reality that we're in. That story, to my mind, couldn't come first, couldn't come in the middle, it has to be last. Cece and Gwenda are bonded as characters. If I had to say like which character feels like second most human, I would probably say Cece. And I think that has to do with the vernacular of her story. But I think there's another thing going on here as well. One thing that I find myself doing a lot as a reader to manage this cast of characters is because I was primed so early on to be thinking about truth. A lot of what I'm doing, I think on a gut level just on first read and much more thoughtfully on second read, is I'm thinking about who can I trust here? Who's going to give me the closest version of reality? Both times I noticed that I was very biased toward our AI friend, Maureen, which tells me something about how I relate to sci-fi, I think. But, you know, I mean,
You trusted Maureen most?
Yeah, because I felt like she had the most access to information. But, I mean, I realize on second read that that's a way in which stories often dupe you by, you know, presenting omniscience that is actually very limited. But yeah, I mean, I did end up identifying characters based on what I felt they were going to tell me about the truth. Sullivan was very limited on the page, but I mean, I immediately noticed that May is a very tentative character who seems to not want to look at reality very closely. I immediately noticed that Portia worries about telling Gwenda about what Cece saw, her vision of the other ship, or like. So I mean, I sort of end up moving through this story and kind of crossing characters out in that way. Yeah. What about you, Matthew? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you covered several of the things that I thought. Before I kind of say anything, I was just thinking, you mentioned vernacular, and thinking about the words dupe and duplicate, right? Like the literal facsimile of something, these two things are the same versus like completely duping someone into thinking something completely different. I don't know, just one of those nice little English
Moments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing about Gwenda that I thought of, or at least that the story made me think of, is that she has completely covered her skin or her canvas, right? So she is full on the outside, but on the inside she is not. And a lot of this story takes place like by Gwenda questioning what she's told, either by Maureen or by one of the storytellers, or like just in general, like you're sitting in a room with like 6 other people and you're at a party and you're telling stories and you're like, I recognize so-and-so acts like this because of this reason. Just
Right.
things that you think in your head.
Right.
You're like, now I'm starting to understand this person more or less based on like information I'm taking in.
Yeah.
And so like I think Gwenda as a character allows the story to move outwards more than some other character within the book would allow.
Yeah.
And that is why we have to follow her.
Fucking A. Oh.
So, as mentioned at the outset, the story is entitled Two Houses, and the final ghost story told by Cece involves a boy she met while she was an ambassador for space in England, drumming up money for extraorbital exploration. Liam, the boy she knows that she says will get her in trouble, though the good kind of trouble, takes her to his ancestral home, which happens to be one of 2 houses. One is a real house that comes from Arizona, and was brought overseas and put back together in the exact condition it was in Arizona when it left. That house happens to be a murder house, right, where a bunch of killings took place. Okay? The second house is an exact replica of the first house. And the reason it's on the ancestral estate is that Liam's parents were very into, or actually, Liam's grandparents were very into art installations and collecting art and so on, right? And so they hired this artist to do this particular installation, right? And so we've got these 2 houses, and the artist had always said that he wanted a family to inhabit at least one of those houses. A lot more can be said about this that I'm not going to cover right at the moment, because thinking about the title, how many iterations of 2 houses exist within this narrative? And what do these likenesses elicit for you?
Yeah, so here's a left field thing that'll hopefully check my tendency to wander farther. But There's this film of a few years ago called What to Believe is a Jackson Pollock, and it's it's a documentary about a woman who finds a Jackson Pollock-esque painting in an antique shop or a consignment shop, and she buys it for a nominal amount of money, and she is told by several people that they think it's a real Jackson Pollock, and it's about her quest to get it approved as a Jackson Pollock, right? And I think that one thing that film asks intelligently is about how we interact with fame or the idea of a particular type of painting or the idea of the uniqueness of an artist and their capacity. What that film doesn't end up asking quite as well as I wished it did, or at least it maintains the kind of energy and pacing of the film by doing this, is that it doesn't quite address the way in which part of how we engage art is through a historical process, right? But it's also how we engage our lives. That Jackson Pollock did or did not paint this painting. It is a drip painting in the style of Jackson Pollock. And the value is an abstract value based on the historical relevance of Jackson Pollock, which we've attributed to Jackson Pollock, which in fact alters the attention that drip paintings get, or whether or not other people go around painting Jackson Pollocks. And I think that becomes part of how we're working through a story like this. There's a murder house. One of these houses is a murder house. It has or hasn't, I can't remember the thought experiment where you take a ship and replace it board by board, and eventually, when is the ship another ship? That it might be that if there are ghosts, that they do or don't live in the house, or the murder house. It might be that they attach themselves to the boards of that house, or that they stay put in the earth. It might be that we manifest the idea of ghosts, so we create the ghosts by moving the house. And I think all of those questions are opened up by the kind of art project that this is. But none of those things matter to whatever reality ghosts do or don't have. And I think that one thing this story does that I get really fascinated with, I didn't count. I thought about counting the number of times that there are manifestations of two houses. I didn't count them. But, right, like, I think there's something about the idea or those questions that gives a certain kind of meaning to the work, right? So, right, at one point Cece sort of apologizes, I'll tell the rest of the story as quickly as I can, and she goes on to explain that Liam said there were, he said he never saw them, but later on, in reference to ghosts, that is, when he lived in other places, he realized that there must have been ghosts in both places, both houses. Other places just felt empty to him. And I don't know if that's the story making a case for our minds manifesting reality. I don't know that I buy into that kind of solipsis thing, but I do think that certainly the characters within the context of the story, through the process of the houses and the way in which something is presented as real to them, manifest something like the ghost of reality. And I think that's right, like even in the way that like Maureen acts as a ghost of reality, right? Like she offers something up. And I think she's a kind of a house in and of herself, a kind of mother figure in and of herself. And when I had that realization about Maureen, that was when I quit counting houses.
What if Marine is controlling both ships?
Moving on to Ingrid.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice exercise with stories to sometimes map them out almost mathematically, and I mean to chart patterns and that kind of thing. I was even lazier than you, Adam, this time, and that I saw that on the first page. There's a question. She could have been back home how many houses ago? And I thought, oh, well, maybe it's infinite, maybe it's uncountable in this case. I think it would be easier to focus just on those Arizona homes and to think about iterations in that case, especially just thinking about those houses, the house that was originally created in Arizona, it getting moved over. Is that still the same house when it's recreated? One of the houses gets burnt down. So I mean, that is a finite number of iterations. But I mean, I think what Link is challenging us to do is to think about reality differently, really inquisitively, and to also think about fakes and copies and what the difference is really. One of my favorite questions that Link ends up posing is, why wouldn't the ghosts just move over to the new house if it's set up exactly in the same way? What's the difference?
Well, I think that there's something about the ideology of houses, right? That like that kind of Greek idea that like if someone gets ostracized, you actually have to kind of raise their home, right? Like and remove their property from the thing. But there's also, right, that like a question of attachment to location of an existing set of things organized in an existing arrangement, right? The artist here doesn't want anything moved within the context of the house because that might alter the scenario that the ghosts are living in, but then there's also the ghosts who are presumably, they are attached to the house. They move with the house, like someone who's picked up and like moved their modular home somewhere or like what have you, and they've been taken, but where do they go or what do they do during that time when, like, do they attach themselves to a particular board if the thing comes apart board by board? Like, how does that all come together, and why do they do what they do as ghosts? Right? Are they attached to the location of the murder? Does the murder, right, like, is the murder in the hand of the murderer? Is the murder in the life and the body of the people? Is it somehow there? I worked at a Boy Scout camp once, and there was a child who was murdered at that Boy Scout camp, and in one of the staff cabins. And when I was there, that was like a haunted cabin. People had this idea about it. And at some point, a couple years after I'd quit working there, they replaced, the child had been hung, and they replaced just the beam on which that death had happened, and some people felt way better about that, and other people thought it was still sort of a travesty, and to keep that building around at all. Eventually the building was replaced entirely, and I talked to several people who felt very strongly that like that was the best thing that could have happened, and other people who felt like that somehow empowered the murderer, and other people who felt like if there was going to be a new cabin, it had to be on a different location because the place held that. And I think all of those questions are sort of emerge out of that in part because there's the house itself, there's how the house is constructed, there's which pieces of the house constitute the house, and there's also, right, like the event that's significant to the ghosts or the potential for ghosts, and where and how that manifests and how it attaches itself.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I mean it's hard to I mean, I think the story is asking, sometimes in funny ways and sometimes in very serious ways, about like horrific things like that. And I mean, does that alter space? I think one more thing I wanted to add, sort of sidelong to that before we move on, is that I think it's important that the two houses that we pay most attention to in this story are art houses, because I think that's the moment where the story's sort of sidelong asking us to think about art and reality, and I mean, maybe our emphasis on originality in art as well, and copies in art, and I mean, a story that's already so rich with questions, I think begins to question its own form as soon as the installation gets introduced.
One thing I think is interesting that we haven't really discussed is that we've been calling her Cece, but you could also call her Sissy, meaning like sister.
Hmm.
And her name is Sisi, Cece.
Yeah.
Like, if it were Spanish, it'd be yes, yes.
Yeah.
Two houses. Yes, yes. Which one's real? Yes. I think one of the other things to consider is like history and the idea that, if it's in the history books, right, like it's fact, it happened. And like all of this, like, and then I'm thinking about documentaries, like films, where it's like, let's go back and like recreate this. And even if they don't recreate it and like just try to like present information as they found it, like in some respect, it's not a documentary. It's not documenting exactly what happened. However, it is a document, right? So it's that whole strangeness like continues to go round and round, and you could, people have erased histories of other people in order to like make as if they did not exist. On the other end of the spectrum, people's histories have been built up to like make them these immense figures when maybe they weren't, right? So I think, as Ingrid has said, right, like this story just like allows so many questions and things to like bubble up that it's so much fun, at least, in my opinion. All right, we're gonna get a little wild because the story's a little wild, and the story's great. Marine is Hal from 2001, Space Odyssey.
Okay.
Which came out in 1968.
Yeah.
Meta is the word. Go. All right, I'm kidding. But only, not really. There are a lot of cultural markers, as I think Ingrid pointed out earlier, in commentary in the story, right? We have Goldilocks, London Bridge, Moby Dick, the Bible, a Celtic cross, right? All kinds of art, the Statue of Liberty, Lewis Carroll, etc. We also have things like Cece suggests that men enjoy women that will soon be leaving. That Liam carries Cece over the threshold of the murder house as if they were just married. She's South African, he's English, and the English colonized South Africa. Liam at one point doesn't know if he's good or bad. Cece catches Liam rolling around in the blood of one of the children in the murder house with a crazed look on his face, as if he were a cat and the blood were a form of catnip. I say all of this, to ask about the little moments and large pronouncements in the story. Sullivan, as we've said, doesn't appear much in the story, but one of the funniest things is he waves at the facsimile ghosts recreated by Marine. There are constant interjections and questions during the telling of the ghost stories, either for clarification or crew members participating in what is being told them. It is stated that Liam's mom, though she gets clean of drugs, takes up religion, and that religion takes up the same amount of space as drugs, leaving Liam inherently alone. Liam plays in both houses, sometimes naps and wakes up, unsure which house he is in. The recognition that Liam is, quote, wrong, a man that's not right, surfaces during Cece's story. Cece herself says the art installation house was weird, like performance pieces are supposed to be, yet not right. Videos of mice eating other mice appear. And finally, the experiment Maureen puts the crew through. First of being inside the art installation murder house, and then quickly moving to the two spaceships and what might have happened to the other crew, and or what might have happened to the crew we follow. You follow me, y'all? Thoughts, interpretations, where the hell are we?
I'll start with your little moments or large pronouncements. I think you actually point us to some of the best ones. They come in Cece or Sissy's story. I actually heard her name as Sissy when I was reading, and thought of her as kind of a sisterly figure. So I was glad you brought that up. So what man doesn't like a girl who doesn't plan to stick around is one thing that Sissy or Cece says. Another is, but there was something about him. You just knew he was going to get you into trouble, the good kind of trouble. I especially feel drawn to that second statement as a reader, not only because the book's called Get in Trouble, and I'm thinking about that, but because it's sort of a perfect example of my favorite kinds of lines in fiction, in that it's specific enough that you get a feeling that you know what someone's talking about, but vague enough that you're not quite sure exactly what is the good kind of trouble. Link doesn't define it, but you have this feeling about it, like you would know it if you saw it, you would know it if you were in it. And I think what I like so much about that is that it's kind of like what I like about minimalism, which we talked about a little bit in the Bolaño, when we were discussing Bolaño's story, and that it really engages me, and instead of, like giving me a specific kind of tree, it gets me to imagine what a good kind of trouble is. And I think because well, I think that's what I have to say about that statement. The other statement I brought up, what man doesn't like a girl who doesn't plan to stick around, is interesting to me in that it's trying to assert something about life, and I think trying to present a certain character's kind of knowledge, and you kind of circle around that yourself and test it out and think, like, is that true of men in general? Is that telling me more about the person who's saying this, which is what I think. Too hard to generalize about men. But yeah, I think those moments and pronouncements especially have a real narrative heat about them. I think I would guess that most readers who read this story pay special attention to those lines.
One thing I want to say, just to jump in quick, is like, I feel like that was the perfect breakdown for one of the things that I dislike in poems, which is the use of just so.
Okay.
As if to suggest it's placed just so,
Yeah.
or the look was just so.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I don't like it, and it's a personal problem, and, it's not to say that no one's ever used it in a good way, but I feel like sometimes it's a lazy thing. Whereas, like, if you say something that is, that brings up that essence without, like, resorting to the, placeholder for that essence in just so, right? Like, it allows much more to happen. Small point, sorry.
I actually think we're saying the same exact thing
Yeah,
in different words.
exactly.
But
Yeah, sorry. I'm just so distracted by that thought for a moment. But no, I think where the hell are we is a good question. In that, like, I think in some ways we're still. I want to say this carefully. It's kind of coming off of your last question, right? That there are iterations of these houses, and those houses matter for the purposes of a story, right? Like, ultimately, right? Like, the good kind of trouble is a statement that Sissy is capable of saying. Um, an indefinite number of years away from this event, knowing that the end of the story is I ran out of this house because this date went horrifically wrong when he was or was not possessed by dead children, whose blood he would roll around in like a cat. And there's something grim about where that's going, but I think also that, like, the good kind of trouble in that way becomes a little bit about something that carries a narrative into this indefinite future, right? Like, Sullivan doesn't say much in this story, but he does tell this fairly efficient tale about a girl who has a tree fall on her, and his grandfather, like, won't go hunting in the woods anymore because her ghost, he can deal with ghosts who walk around, but he can't deal with a ghost who's, like, crawling. And, you know, like, there's a sort of hyper-logical interpretation of how ghosts work there, not only because, right, like, this particular ghost has to crawl because she takes on how she dies, and because, you know, like, she's, you know, somehow defined by the upper half of her body and not by the, like, half that, I don't know, might be able to still walk around if it could stand itself upright. But also because Sullivan is aggravated by that story, even though he's telling it, because it doesn't have a point to him, because the ghosts have to be about, the point of ghosts is to educate you. And a ghost who just lives in the horror of her accident doesn't teach you anything at all.
So he says, but, like, his father, I think, like, isn't that commentary on
Yeah.
the fact that you shouldn't hunt
Yeah.
and eat meat?
Something like that. Yeah. But I think that, like, all those things turn into the oddities of how that story is, but ultimately what it wants you to know is that somehow, right, like, these narratives are the thing of these people's lives. You never really find out why they need to be asleep the whole time. At first, I sort of assume that the reasoning behind that is just so, like, while the ship is drifting along, while they're looking for a Goldilocks planet, you know, they are Goldilockses metaphorically, but also they're not going to age too much and die, and the hair is some kind of, like, indicator of that. But also, like, their lives are already behind them. Like, this is this kind of living version of death.
Well,
in
'cause
infinity.
everything they know is dead.
Yeah, and it's just each other, and the only things they have to share are Marine's infinity of knowledge, which she can share or not, and the stories about each other. And I think, like, you know, anybody who has known anyone for, you know, any given period of time knows that that repetition, like, changes the way that you experience people and shifts and becomes its own thing. But I don't know, I think what we're doing is we're dealing in all of those things, and, like, we're living in that aftermath of all of it, right? Like, none of it, sort of nothing is real for them anymore, right? The final house is the realest house to them. The house in which they see the murder house recreated as the murder house, and they don't know which murder house. It is a recreation of that this guy's rolling around in the blood of. But I think that's the moment at which they're sort of most alive and with each other, because they're capable of sharing something that is a facsimile of something that's already gone.
Yeah, it's like I keep thinking of the snake, and how like a snake sheds its skin and moves on as like quote unquote a new snake, but you never move on as a completely new snake. You don't lose your consciousness.
Yeah.
And like that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons why we read, right? Like, is that we have this consciousness that we can't like leave behind. We have this life that we can't leave behind, and like we've created this other thing to like divert our consciousness from constantly thinking about replaying everything we've done all these years.
Yeah.
I think all of that's really well put. I think one way that I relate to this story is that I think I'm not the sort of reader who needs an answer at the end. But I mean, I think in a lot of ways this story wants to confuse and question and wants to be treated a little like a puzzle. So I think it pushes me to that space a little more than other stories. But I think, I don't know, I'm not the sort of reader who needs to math it out. Like, I think I want to feel it more than I want to know it. And I think I really love the ending and where it takes me. And I think for readers who are more interested in sort of getting to the bottom of what happens and what doesn't, the ending is a good place to go. So what happens is Maureen tells the final ghost story after Sissy's or Cece's. I sort of misspoke before. Hers is the last of the crew members' stories, and then comes Maureen, and Maureen enters into it by saying that she does know a ghost story after all, and what she ends up doing is she takes them to the great room, which we've been introduced to early on. They're floating somehow in a great nothingness. The room grows darker, colder, and first they see the lost crew of the ship of the House of Mystery sitting around the table. And they're maimed by a catastrophe. They lift their ruined hands and wave and smile. And then there's a smell of char and chemicals and icy rot that Gwenda almost knew. And so you're thinking about Maureen, and that you know that smell is one of her abilities. The almost is interesting, and I like it that it comes back. Let's see, where does it come back? I'm not seeing it immediately, but anyway, what ends up happening is I'll read a little. And then it was her own friends around the table, May, Sullivan, Portia, Ioun, Sissy, and she saw herself sitting there, hacked almost into, there's my almost. She got up, moved toward herself, then vanished. The great room reshaped itself out of nothingness and horror. They were back in the English country house. The air was full of sour spray someone had thrown up. Someone else sobbed. Ioun said, "Maureen, that was unkind." Maureen said nothing. She went about the room like a ghost, coaxing the vomit into a ball. "The hell was that?" Cece said. "Maureen, what were you thinking? Gwenda, my darling." She reached for Gwenda's hand, but Gwenda pushed away. She went forward in a great spasm, her arms extended to catch the wall. Going before her on the right hand, the ship. house of secrets, and on the left, house of mystery. She could no longer tell the one from the other. So I guess what I would say is, I think that seems like the most horrible ghost story of all, too. It's a psychological story, and one in which your own reality is questioned and you're living in it. So, I mean, I think if I had Maureen's powers, she chose a pretty scary one. I think where I feel left as a reader is with Gwenda in that space of uncertainty and sort of pushing away from her friend, like in this terrorized space where she's wondering what she is and what her friends are and reviewing that for herself. But I mean, kind of in this place of like bodily horror as well, where like it's a spasm, it's like a tightness about the body, and this like looking at her hands. I think there's something about that that feels really real to me, and I think that's where I leave the story.
It's a good place to end. You wake up years later and you can't recognize your own hands. Thanks for joining us today, friends.
Thank you.
I hope you will take a look at Kelly Link at some point. It is a lot of fun. We bid you adieu until next time.
Bye, thank you.